The blizzard had swallowed the valley whole, erasing every familiar trail beneath sheets of white. Ranger Daniel Hayes trudged forward, each step sinking into the snow with a heavy crunch. He wasn't supposed to be here. Protocol warned against venturing so deep into the wilderness alone during a storm, but something in the radio call about strange animal sounds wouldn't let him stay behind. The forest howled like a wounded beast, and beneath that chorus came a sound so faint it barely existed. A whimper, raw and fragile, carried on the wind. Daniel's pulse quickened. Following the sound, he pushed through a wall of frozen branches until the clearing opened before him. There, curled into a trembling knot, was a wolf pup no older than 4 months. Its fur, once meant to shield against the cold, clung to its frail body in matted clumps. Dark streaks of blood stained the snow around it, telling a silent story of a brutal struggle. Gashes marked its side, signs of an attack, perhaps by larger predators that had seen in this pup an easy meal. Daniel dropped to his knees, breath catching in his throat. In 15 years of service, he had found many creatures too late, victims of winter, hunger, or the brutal balance of nature. But this one was still alive. The pup's chest rose in shallow, ragged movements, each breath sending up a tiny cloud of mist. Its eyes, half closed, glazed with exhaustion, lifted weakly to meet his. And in that gaze, Daniel saw something no handbook could prepare him for. Not just fear, not just pain, but a plea. His training screamed at him to back away. Wolves were dangerous, even as pups, and interference could spell disaster later. Yet the storm around him faded into silence as he looked at the small body crumpled against the snow. For a moment, it wasn't a wild animal lying there. It was simply a life, fragile and begging for another chance. Daniel's gloved hands trembled. He knew the consequences, handling a wild predator, breaking every regulation in the Ranger Manual. But leaving it here was an unspoken death sentence. "You're not going to die tonight," he whispered, voice barely audible against the storm. He pulled off his thermal blanket, wrapping the shivering pup as gently as he could, cradling its fragile weight against his chest. The pup whimpered, its faint cry swallowed by the wind, but its eyes never left his. In that moment, Daniel wasn't thinking about rules or repercussions. He was thinking about survival, about one small chance to defy the cold, the blood, and the inevitability of nature. And so, with his decision made, Daniel turned back through the storm, carrying not just a wolf pup, but the beginning of a story that would change both their lives forever. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center roared to life the moment Daniel burst through its doors, snow still clinging to his jacket. In his arms lay the pup, a fragile bundle wrapped in the ranger's thermal blanket, its shallow breaths barely audible above the chaos. The staff, veterinarians, interns, and volunteers, had seen countless injured animals, but the urgency in Daniel's eyes told them this case was different. Dr. Elena Rivera, the center's lead veterinarian, snapped into action. "Get him to the emergency bay now," she ordered. The sterile room transformed into a battlefield of medicine and hope. Heat lamps blazed, for lines were prepared, and oxygen masks were adjusted with trembling precision. Daniel stood back at first, his gloves stained with blood and his heart hammering in his chest. The pup's condition was dire. Hypothermia had dragged his body temperature to dangerous lows. His wounds, deep and jagged, hinted at an attack that should have ended his short life hours earlier. Infection had already taken hold. Its fevered tremors made even the seasoned staff exchange uneasy glances. Each new test brought grim results: irregular heartbeat, kidney stress, shallow lung function. Every second felt like watching a candle flame guttering in the wind. Daniel couldn't leave. He hovered at the edge of the room, silent, his eyes fixed on the fragile life fighting before him. Rules said his job ended when the animal reached the center, but his conscience refused to let him walk away. When the staff rotated shifts through the long night, Daniel stayed planted by the incubator, whispering in a low, steady voice. He told the pup stories about the forest where he had found him, about streams that never froze and hills where the snow melted first in spring. His words were quiet, almost meaningless, yet they carried something no medicine could: presence. The days blurred together. Every few hours, alarms pierced the room, blood pressure crashing, oxygen levels dipping, infections raging. Nurses hurried with antibiotics, fluids, and heat packs, while Elena's brow furrowed with exhaustion. But each time the pup's small chest threatened to still, Daniel's voice would cut through the beeping machines. "Stay with me. Fight." He pressed his gloved hand against the glass of the incubator, as if his strength could seep through to the fragile creature within. On the third night, when the snowstorm outside finally broke, a sliver of hope pierced the gloom. The pup's fever lowered, its breathing steadied, and for the first time since its rescue, its eyes fluttered open. They weren't the eyes of a feral predator. They were clear, intelligent, searching. They found Daniel immediately. Something unspoken passed in that gaze. The pup shifted weakly, nose twitching, as if trying to move closer to the voice that had never left its side. Elena shook her head in disbelief. "That shouldn't be possible," she murmured. Wolves avoided human contact at all costs, especially in such a fragile state. But the pup's trembling paw stretched toward the glass, resting against it exactly where Daniel's hand pressed. The room went still. Machines hummed. Staff exchanged silent glances, but Daniel's chest swelled with a hope he hadn't dared to feel. "That's it, little one," he whispered. "You're stronger than this." From that moment on, something changed. The staff worked harder, more carefully, as if buoyed by the strange bond blooming before their eyes. The pup, whom Elena later named Shadow for his dark, smoky coat, showed a resilience no one expected. Each day, he clung to life with a determination that mirrored the ranger's refusal to leave his side. And as Shadow's strength returned, so too did a connection, one that seemed to defy every law of the wild. Spring crept over the mountains, melting the snow that had once threatened to claim Shadow's life. Weeks turned into months, and the pup who had once fit into Daniel's arms now bounded across his rehabilitation enclosure with growing confidence. His wounds had healed, his ribs no longer pressed against his fur, and his eyes, once clouded with pain, now gleamed with sharp intelligence. But what astonished everyone at the center wasn't just his recovery. It was the unshakable connection he carried with Daniel. Wolves rarely tolerated human presence, even when raised in captivity. Most growled, snapped, or retreated when approached. But Shadow was different. He recognized Daniel's footsteps long before he appeared, pacing near the fence until his savior arrived. The moment Daniel's shadow stretched across the enclosure, Shadow would emit a low, rumbling whine, a sound the staff began to recognize not as aggression, but as greeting. Daniel tried to keep his distance. Dr. Rivera reminded him constantly that Shadow needed to remain wild if he was to return to the forest. "Bonding is dangerous," she cautioned one morning as they watched Shadow leap over a fallen log inside his pen. "He can't depend on you. If he sees humans as family, he'll never survive out there." Daniel nodded, but his heart betrayed him. The first time Shadow limped over to him after medical treatment and pressed his nose against the fence, Daniel hadn't turned away. He knelt there, eye to eye with the animal, feeling that familiar pull, the same one he'd felt in the storm. Something inside him whispered that this bond wasn't weakness. It was survival. To prepare Shadow for the wild, the staff introduced enrichment challenges. They hid food under logs, buried meat beneath snow piles, and stocked the enclosure stream with fish. What stunned them was how quickly Shadow learned, not just from instinct, but from imitation. When Daniel stood outside the fence, breaking apart a log to reveal crawling insects, Shadow mirrored the action with astonishing precision. When Daniel knelt by the stream and mimed striking at the water, Shadow followed suit, his paws slicing into the current until he emerged with a wriggling fish. The interns whispered that the wolf wasn't just learning. He was watching Daniel, studying him, trusting him. By summer, Shadow had grown tall and strong, his thick coat rippling with health. He could run the length of his enclosure in seconds, leap effortlessly onto rocks, and dig with the power of an adult wolf. Yet no matter how wild he became, he never forgot the man who had carried him from death's edge. In the quiet hours of dawn, Daniel would sometimes arrive early, coffee steaming in his hands. Without fail, Shadow would already be there, waiting at the fence as though he'd been listening for that familiar rhythm of footsteps. Word of the bond spread beyond the center. Local journalists arrived first, filming short features about the ranger and his wolf. Wildlife researchers soon followed, eager to document the unusual relationship. Many shook their heads in disbelief when they saw Shadow's response to Daniel. Ears perked, body relaxed, eyes focused with something that looked dangerously close to affection. "This isn't just survival," one biologist murmured after watching Shadow imitate Daniel's movements. "This is memory, recognition, maybe even loyalty." But for Daniel, it wasn't about scientific marvels. It was about the quiet, unexplainable feeling every time Shadow's amber eyes locked onto his. It was the mornings when Shadow would sit silently by the fence, the evenings when he would pace until Daniel came, and the rare moments when the wolf would tilt his head as if understanding words spoken softly through the chain links. Still, beneath the wonder of their bond lay an unspoken truth. Shadow was growing too fast, too strong, too wild for walls. By his second year, he weighed more than 90 pounds, his frame powerful, his instincts undeniable. The forest called to him in ways even Daniel couldn't silence. That reality weighed heavily on Daniel. Each visit, each shared glance, carried a shadow of dread, because one day soon, he would have to do what his heart feared most: let go. Dr. Rivera noticed his quietness during meetings. "You knew this day would come," she reminded him gently. "Shadow was never yours to keep. He belongs out there." Daniel forced a nod, though his chest ached. He had saved Shadow to give him a second chance at freedom. But how do you say goodbye to something that has become part of your soul? As autumn painted the mountains gold, the team began preparing for Shadow's release. The announcement alone felt like a storm breaking inside Daniel. He spent long hours by the enclosure fence, memorizing every detail: the way Shadow's coat glistened in the sunlight, the rhythm of his movements, the deep, rumbling whine that greeted him each day. Shadow, too, seemed to sense the shift. His pacing grew restless. His eyes lingered longer on Daniel. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, Daniel thought he heard the wolf's soft whine echoing through the corridors of the center, as if searching for reassurance. The day was approaching, unstoppable as winter itself. The bond that had defied nature, that had turned strangers into something closer than family, would soon face its greatest test. And deep down, Daniel knew their story was far from over. The morning of Shadow's release dawned cold and sharp, the sky painted with streaks of orange and crimson. For most at the rehabilitation center, it was a day of triumph. The successful recovery and return of a wolf that should have died in a snowstorm. But for Daniel, it felt like walking toward the edge of cliff. Shadow paced in his enclosure, ears twitching, eyes restless. He sensed it. Animals always did. The staff had prepared for this day meticulously. Tranquilizer darts on standby, transport crates reinforced, and the release site chosen with care. A remote valley deep in the forest, far from human settlements, rich with prey and shelter. A place where a wolf could thrive. But Shadow was no ordinary wolf. And Daniel wasn't just a ranger today. He was saying goodbye to a piece of himself. Getting Shadow into the transport cage wasn't easy. Though he had been trained with food lures, Shadow resisted, pacing with agitation, his low whines cutting through Daniel's chest. Other wolves would have snarled or snapped, but Shadow's sounds were different, confused, questioning, almost pleading. Finally, Daniel stepped forward, his presence alone enough to calm him. With Daniel's soft voice guiding him, Shadow entered the crate, his amber eyes never leaving the man who had been at his side since the beginning. The journey to the release site took 2 hours, winding through mountain roads glazed with frost. Daniel rode in the back, seated inches from the crate. Shadow lay inside, silent but watchful. Daniel spoke in a low murmur, recounting memories as though the wolf could understand. Remember the stream? The first fish you caught? His voice cracked. You were so proud. Shadow's ears flicked at the sound, his gaze steady, and Daniel wondered if somewhere beneath that wild exterior, the wolf truly did remember. When the truck finally rolled to a stop, silence descended. The forest stretched out before them, vast and endless. Pines towered overhead, their needles whispering in the crisp wind. The release team moved with hushed efficiency, setting the crate at the forest's edge. Daniel stepped forward to open the door. His hands shook despite the cold. He knew the protocol. Don't linger, don't make it harder, don't interfere with the animal's natural instincts. But protocol had meant nothing the day he picked up a dying pup in the snow, and it meant even less now. The latch clicked. The door swung open. For a long moment, Shadow didn't move. He crouched at the threshold, nose lifted, inhaling the wild air that was now his to claim. The forest smelled of pine and earth, of rivers and prey, of everything his instincts yearned for. Freedom lay one step away. Yet instead of bolting, Shadow turned. His gaze locked on Daniel. The team froze, every breath suspended. Wolves weren't supposed to do this. They were supposed to vanish into the trees, eager to put distance between themselves and humans. But Shadow stepped forward, not into the forest, but toward the man who had saved him. Daniel's vision blurred as Shadow emerged from the crate, his massive frame rippling with health and strength. He walked up to Daniel slowly, deliberately, until they stood only feet apart. Then, in a gesture that silenced the entire valley, Shadow rose slightly on his hind legs and pressed his nose against Daniel's chest. It lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough to shatter everyone present. Tears spilled freely, not just from Daniel, but from the hardened rangers, the interns, even Dr. Rivera, who had warned him so often about the dangers of attachment. Daniel's throat tightened as he whispered, "Go on, boy. Be free." Shadow held his gaze, amber eyes burning with something beyond instinct, something that looked achingly like recognition. Then, with a final soft whine, he turned. His paws carried him into the trees, muscles flowing beneath his thick coat. Within seconds, the forest swallowed him whole, leaving only silence and the faint rustle of branches. Daniel stood rooted in place, staring at the empty clearing. The ache in his chest was unbearable, but so was the pride. Shadow was where he belonged. Free. Alive. The team didn't speak for several minutes. No one wanted to break the sacred stillness of what they had just witnessed. Finally, Dr. Rivera placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "That was extraordinary," she said quietly. "You gave him everything he needed, including the strength to leave." The drive back to the center was somber. The empty crate rattled in the back, its silence heavier than any weight Daniel had ever carried. He kept his hand resting on it, remembering the warmth of Shadow's body pressed against the blanket years ago, remembering the sound of that first faint whimper in the storm. He told himself he should be proud, that this was the goal from the very beginning. But pride couldn't fill the space Shadow had carved into his heart. Days turned into weeks, then months. Daniel returned to his ranger duties, patrolling the same mountains where he had once found a dying pup in the snow. Every snapped twig, every rustle in the underbrush sent his heart racing with hope. But the wolf he had saved was gone, swallowed by the wild as though he had never existed. Still, at night, Daniel would sometimes hear the echo of a soft whine carried on the wind, and he would close his eyes, whispering into the dark, "Be strong, Shadow. Be free." He didn't know it then, but their story wasn't finished. Not yet. 3 years passed. Seasons came and went across the Montana wilderness, each one carrying Daniel further from that final goodbye at the clearing. He told himself Shadow was gone, living the life he was meant to, hunting, roaming, perhaps even leading a pack. But deep down, the emptiness never left. The memory of amber eyes holding his at the moment of release haunted him in both dreams and silence. Then came a call. A research team monitoring wolf activity in the northern range had reported unusual behavior. A large male wolf was repeatedly circling the same valleys, showing an odd, lingering interest in human campsites. Not aggressive, just watching. They needed a ranger to assess the risk. Daniel volunteered before anyone else could answer. At the research station, they showed him weeks of footage. Grainy images of a powerful wolf, his coat dark and full, his frame massive, easily 120 pounds. But it wasn't his size that stole Daniel's breath. It was his eyes. Even through the lens, they carried a familiarity that made his heart ache. The next morning, Daniel joined the researchers in the field. They hiked to a ridge overlooking a valley where the wolf had been seen. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the wind. Daniel's hands trembled as he raised his binoculars, scanning the tree-line. And then, movement. A shadow slipped from the forest. The wolf emerged into the clearing, his coat gleaming in the sun. He paused, head lifted, nose twitching at the air. And then, across the distance, his amber eyes locked onto Daniel. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The wolf stepped forward. Then another. Then he released a soft, low whine. The same sound Daniel had once heard through the walls of an incubator. The same sound that had followed him in dreams. Tears blurred Daniel's vision as he whispered, "Shadow, it's you." The wolf approached until only a few yards separated them. Cameras clicked furiously. Researchers whispered in disbelief, but Daniel heard none of it. All he heard was that familiar whine. All he saw were the eyes that had once pleaded for life in the snow. In that moment, Ranger and Wolf stood together again. Two survivors bound by something stronger than time, distance, or the laws of nature. Their story was no longer just about rescue. It was proof of a truth the world needed to remember. That compassion leaves a mark no wilderness can erase.